Welcome, everyone. So pleased to see everyone. I'm Professor Nancy Sinkoff. I'm the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and Professor of Jewish Studies and History. As I think many of you know, we have a very loyal following, and I'm delighted to see you virtually, if you will. Tonight's speaker is Professor Yehudah Mirsky, and his topic is Mystical Zionism's Surprising Origins, Rav Kook's Early Decades. But he will also, in the second part of his talk about the legacy of Rav Kook. The ground rules for this kind of webinar format is that all of you out there in the ether are muted. If you have a question, we ask that you put it into the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat throughout Professor Mirsky's talk. And I will pose questions to him midway around 7:25:26 about the first part of his presentation. Then we will resume, and then we will open up again the chat, and I will pose the questions in the second part. So please take advantage of our fantastic guest, his erudition, his knowledge of Rav Kook, and of Zionism, and of mysticism and messianism, these things that interface with contemporary and past Zionism. And please use the chat for your questions. Yehudah Mirsky is a professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University, and he's also on the faculty of Brandeis University's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. His scholarship focuses on the intersections of politics and religion, the historical and theological underpinnings of liberalism and human rights, and ecological ethics. He has a wide palette, the intersection of religion and ethical behavior, ethical norms. He teaches courses on medieval and modern Jewish thought, the history of Zionism and the State of Israel, and on political and ethical thought. His book, Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, which is part of the Yale's Jewish Lives series, came out in 2014, and it won the Jewish Book Council's Choice Prize. It appeared then in 2021 in a revised Hebrew edition as Rav Kook, Mabat Chadash, with Kinneret Publishing House, and Haaretz named it as one of the 50 best books of 2021. That year also saw the publication of an English book, Towards the Mystical Experience of Modernity, The Making of Rav Kook, 1865 to 1904, with Academic Studies Press. Besides the scholarly work that Professor Mirsky is involved with, he also writes to the public on topics of religion, politics, and culture for venues like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, and many other publications. I'm honored to have him here. We go back a long way, and I know we will all enjoy learning from him tonight. So please welcome Professor Yehudah Mirsky.
So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you, Robin, and Karen, and of course, Professor Sinkoff, who, in addition to just, it's always a pleasure to see you. I have to acknowledge that the work that I'm talking about this evening was made possible in part by your own researches. So it's a special pleasure to be here. So the topic is like the surprising origins of mystical Zionism. And what do we mean by mystical Zionism? Well, there's this figure whom one hears about a great deal, Rav Kook. In Israel, one hears about him a very great deal, down to the present. He was born in 1865, dies in 1935. And from 1904 on is the chief rabbi of Jaffa and the surrounding colonies, which is to say, he's the chief rabbi of the new Jewish community of the land of Israel / Palestine, the new Yishuv. After World War I, he becomes first the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Jerusalem, then in 1921, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi, and in many ways, the founder of the chief rabbinate as a new, distinctively modern institution, and he dies in 1935. Now, he's very widely known, and usually what he's widely known for are two things. One, he is the rabbinical figure, the most important rabbinical figure who endorses the Zionist movement, and again, and he's regarded as the foundational thinker of religious Zionism. In many ways, that's true, as well as, of course, his role in founding the Chief Rabbinate. Now, these are very well-known facts about him. They're what most immediately comes to mind, and yet, in many ways, to me, they're the less interesting things about him. What's fascinating to me about him is his story as a human being, and the ways in which he, as an individual, throws himself into the massively conflicted Jewish experience of modern times, especially in his time and place. And I mean, he's a huge figure that one could talk about in all kinds of ways for a very long time. But what I'd like to focus on certainly in this evening, before we get to later on his legacy and his place and his contested legacy, are as the title of the talk indicates, his surprising path to Zionism. Because, we generally think of Zionism as this political movement, and people join the Zionist movement, and, they're largely motivated, say, by political concerns, especially, say, combating anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. And what's really interesting is that he's this, among other things, he's this outstanding figure in Zionist history for whom that's not the case. He never formally joins the Zionist movement. What's more, his way to Zionism is not out of reflecting on Jewish politics or anti-Semitism. He cares about it. He tries to help Jews in trouble, but that's not a fundamental part of his thought world. And the point that I'd like to make here, and where he's a unique figure, but also an illustrative figure, is that this is somebody he's a great example of people who come to Zionism as a way of dealing with certain philosophical problems, theological problems, and in his case, even religious problems or questions that are preoccupying him. And like all great thinkers, he at one and the same time is engrossed with perennial questions of Jewish thought. What is the meaning of Torah? What is the meaning of Jewish existence? What's God's relationship to the world? What's the Jewish people's relationship with other nations and other peoples, etc.? While at the same time, deeply concerned about his own time and place and understanding his own time and place in light of larger, long-standing Jewish religious theological concerns. So let me stop being so abstract for a few minutes. And he's born in 1865 in what today we regard Latvia, but culturally it's the Jewish sphere of Lithuania. And he is, on his father's side, he's from a Litvak scholastic mitnagid non/anti-Hasidic family, and on his mother's side, he's from a family of Chabad Hasidim. And in addition to just its being a point of biographic information, much of his life, he used to say that, like, his parents had this playful running argument: would he grow up to be excuse me, the light in my office tends to go off sometimes. Would he be a Lithuanian style scholastic Talmudist, or would he be some sort of charismatic Hasidic Rebbe? And of course, in his own fashion, he's both and neither. The milieu in which he grows up is one that is characterized by, and I'm sorry, I need to move so I get the light back on. This is I'm terribly sorry about this. If I can, great. Well, all of his books have the word light in the title, so I guess it's not inappropriate. He grows up in a milieu where Jewish identity is already being severely questioned and contested in all kinds of ways. So he's born in 1865. By the end of the 1870s, liberalism in Russia is a dead letter, by and large, and Jews are becoming radicalized. Either they're moving to America. People who thought that they could have more liberalizing forms of Jewish life in Tsarist Russia have been disappointed. We have traditional rabbis who were experimenting with Enlightenment, becoming more reactionary and sort of more like what we call like orthodoxy, etc. And we have Haskalah, we have Enlightenment, but Enlightenment in very moderate forms. Now, he grows up in this intense rabbinic milieu. He goes to the Volozhin Yeshiva, among whose alumni were, say, Chaim Nachman Bialik, And one of his classmates was Mikhail Yosef Berdichevsky, who before long emerges as sort of the enfant terrible of modern Hebrew literature, the person who asserts that Zionism or Jewish nationalism has to be a rebellion against Jewish history, a rebellion against tradition. From the outset, he's fascinated by principled heretical rebels against the tradition, even in his early years. Um, and and after yeshiva, he becomes the rabbi of a small shtetl, and he seems to be on the path to be a sort of Lithuanian scholar and a bit of a public intellectual. And then he experiences a terrible personal tragedy. His wife, the mother of his daughter, dies rather suddenly of tuberculosis. And he undertakes a kind of inward spiritual quest and starts delving deeply into the world of Jewish mysticism, not necessarily of Hasidic mysticism, but of one of the better kept secrets of modern Jewish intellectual history is Lithuanian mysticism. Uh, Students, latter-day students of the Gaon of Vilna, who were deeply immersed in the Kabbalah. Now, because of Rav Kook's place in the Zionist pantheon, we usually assume, well, of course, he must have been involved in this early on, and he must have been writing about the land of Israel and all that kind of thing. But the thing is, he wasn't. And this is something that in the course of my researches I discovered, and it surprised me a great deal at first. But the point is that he comes to Zionism, as I said, because it helps him deal with certain philosophical, theological questions that he's thinking about as a young Jewish rabbinic intellectual coming of age in the modernizing, destabilized Jewish world of what we now know were the later stages of Imperial Russia. And if we look at his writings, you see that what really the philosophical questions that are really animating him um, are a little abstract. He's really concerned with the relationship between body and soul. How does the body relate to the mind and the soul? I mean, this is a hardy perennial of philosophy and certainly of Jewish thought. What is the point of connection between the body and the mind? And he also thinks an awful lot about the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, particularly where morality is concerned, because he's alive to the discussions that are going on all around him, and discussions about liberalism and about socialism and about universalist type ethics, which resonate with many things in Jewish tradition. And his former yeshiva classmates who are now on the socialist barricades are regularly proclaiming all we're doing is living out the visions of the prophets and the greatest ethical teachings of the rabbis and so on. And that's why we have to leave the tradition. And he's struck by what seems to be the inadequacy of standard, let's call it orthodox theology, to deal with questions of historical change, to deal with questions of modern science, to deal with things like the theory of evolution, to deal with the increasingly sophisticated world of modern philosophy. He never goes to university, but in those days, if you visit the website of the National Library of Israel, you'll see PDFs of all kinds of Hebrew and Yiddish periodicals from for decades or even centuries, and certainly from the latter decades of the 19th and the early 20th century. And you'll see there was like remarkably intense conversation going on. And he's following all of this. And he starts writing. He writes a very obscure treatise on tefillin shel rosh, the tefillin that you wear over here on your head. And it seems a little odd, except in the sermons that he writes at the same time, he writes an awful lot again about the body and the mind. And you see, like, it's very strange that he focuses on tefillin until you realize that he's really trying to understand how does the body relate to something that is not bodily, and the mitzvah of tefillin seems to represent that for him. Where he writes these sermons, and not only there, and this is another crucial thing, and it's a crucial part of his internal journey, is that he writes journals. And that may not sound like a big deal, except very few Jewish mystics ever wrote diaries or journals. Journaling and spiritual journaling is spiritual diaries are a very important part of other mystical traditions, certainly in Christian mysticism, but in Jewish mysticism, much less. And yet it's one of the things that he starts doing after the death of his first wife is he starts keeping a journal and using it. In some respects, it starts off as a conventional journal of, little insights on Parshat HaShavua, that sort of thing. But after a while, it becomes this sort of laboratory for intense theological explorations, including in the laboratory after a while becomes his own soul and his own self, because he notices something else about himself. And this may sound odd, but believe me, it's important. He really enjoys studying the non-halachic portions of rabbinic literature. He loves studying Agadot. He loves studying the parts of the Talmud that aren't legal, but that are sermonic, or that are stories, or dream interpretation. Now, that may seem like a nice thing, except you realize if you're a proper Lithuanian Talmudist, you're not supposed to like that, right? You're not supposed to be interested in stories, in the kind of, bits of biblical exegesis that, women and children could understand, right? Sort of in the literature that he's raised on, this is what you teach women and children. It's not what serious grown-up people do. And yet he loves it. And in his journals, he writes, it seems that my soul tends in a certain direction. And maybe I should follow it, especially because if I can teach from this, if I can be helpful to other people with this. And there's something else going on around him in the 1890s. And we're still in a very fairly circumscribed rabbinic world of Eastern Europe. And that's the advent of Musar movement, the movement for moral and spiritual rejuvenation, inaugurated by Rabbi Israel Salanter, and whose disciples he eventually decamps for Western Europe. But in the 1890s, the Musar movement explodes in the world of the Lithuanian yeshivot, and it becomes very controversial. Some people think here's this wonderful vehicle for spiritual enhancement and growth and ethical self-cultivation. And other people think, no, this is terrible. This is a waste of time. This isn't how Talmudists are supposed to do things. And these people become very self-obsessed. There are all these like amazing memoirs of people like studying Musar in these yeshivot and banging their heads on the table and screaming at themselves and all of that. He starts writing a commentary, Rav Kook, he starts writing a commentary on the Agadic portions of the Talmud. He draws a lot on the medieval philosophical tradition, Maimonides, and he basically says, I want to write, Musar has the right idea that the religious life and the rabbinic life needs to come alive, and it needs to be about moral and ethical self-cultivation, and it needs to work out of like a wider palette of human experience, but it also needs to be channeled through study. And so he starts writing this commentary on Agadah that is philosophically minded, so that people can like study these like seemingly easy portions of the Talmud and yet engage in a kind of moral and spiritual reflection while they're doing it. And at the same time, he's writing in his journal about this seems to be how I contribute to things. Maybe other people have ways of contributing to things through ways in which they seem to be marching to different drummers of their own, thinking all the while about the principled rebels with whom he was in yeshiva. And then there's something more. I mentioned that he was a Lithuanian Kabbalist. Central to Lithuanian Kabbalah is the Kabbalah of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, the very important figure from the 18th century, whose work Mesilat Yesharim, his moral work, is also very important for the Musar movement. Central to Luzzatto's Kabbalah is this idea that redemption, in his language, tikkun, is something that happens within historical time, right? And this is something that you start seeing in different kinds of early modern Jewish thinkers, that perhaps redemption isn't something that descends on high by divine fiat. Perhaps redemption is something that happens from below through historical processes. And so Rav Kook is thinking that maybe there's something about the self-discovery of these young idealists who, crucial for him, are that they're self-sacrificing, right? He begins to develop a kind of argument with his rabbinic peers. And the argument with his rabbinic peers can sort of be in flip colloquial fashion summed up as, hey, Rabotai, gentlemen, these young people who I went to yeshiva with, and now they are full-blown heretics and chalutzim and revolutionaries, they're not looking for easy lives. They're not rebelling against us because they want to eat cheeseburgers. They're fighting the Tsar and getting sent to Siberia. They are moving to Palestine and they're draining the swamps and they're building a new culture and a new Jewish society. And they say that we don't care enough about the Jewish poor, and they have a point. We don't care enough about society as a whole, and they have a point. Our religious ideas are outdated, and they have a point. Now, crucially, he will always, always say that the way to respond is not to junk the tradition, but to look more deeply into it. And precisely because he has massive erudition in the entirety of Jewish tradition, not just Talmud and codes, but also philosophy and mysticism and the Bible and liturgy. And so over time, he begins to develop this notion that what looks like the collapse of traditional Jewish society, that he might actually be witnessing a new kind of rebirth. A kind of rebirth of the Jewish people, a sort of a revolution against old things that don't necessarily need to be discarded, but that need to be synthesized into something new. Because there's another thing, there's another element. And he develops in these years what I would consider sort of like a theodicy of modernity. In that, on the one hand, he's a great believer in God and God's providence. On the other hand, traditional Jewish society is falling apart. So how does this happen? Well, maybe this collapse of traditional Jewish life and the rebellions against it by these principled, self-sacrificing heretics who care deeply for the Jewish people and for humanity are God's way of moving us forward. And remember, we said he was concerned about body and mind. Maybe the Jewish people moving back to the land of Israel in this way will bring about some kind of new Jewishness that is both bodily and spiritual. I'll say more about that in a moment. And so there's these ideas that slowly come together with him in this very distinctive sort of way. Now, he's offered this job to be the rabbi of Jaffa and the surrounding colonies. And friends of his say, what are you doing this for? You're not part of the Zionist movement. You see, there was a religious wing of the Zionist movement called the Mizrahi. It was founded in 1902. The standard rabbinic response to the advent of Zionism and Theodor Herzl's Zionism was, of course, to be repelled by it, right? Theodor Herzl is nobody's idea of a traditional Messiah. He's this like utterly secular and assimilated person. And remember, like the exile is supposed to end when God says it ends. It's not supposed to be ended by some unchurched, Sabbath desecrating Viennese playwright. There are some rabbis, though, who, again, create a religious party within the World Zionist Organization in 1902. And their argument is, of all the different schemes on offer to ameliorate Jewish social, political, and economic disability, this seems to be the best one. But please don't tell us that this is all about like spiritual renaissance or cultural renovation or something. No, just leave that out of this. Rav Kook becomes this champion of Zionism precisely for the spiritual and the cultural revolution. The political stuff doesn't interest him that much. So again, when he gets this job in Yafo, friends write him and say, what are you doing? This isn't you. You're not part of this whole Zionist thing. But he's after something else. And where these ideas come together shortly, where we see it all coming together is shortly after he arrives in 1904, Theodor Herzl dies. And he gives a eulogy for him. And by this point, he's in his late 30s, and he has this full-blown philosophy of history. And he says, originally we have the Judaism of the Bible. And that is, because also he works off, there's this figure in rabbinic literature, Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, the son of Joseph. He's an obscure figure in rabbinic literature, a proto-messianic figure who then dies so that the ultimate Davidic Messiah can come. So he says, well, maybe let's look at it like this. And again, it's a long story short, but the Judaism of the Bible is very embodied The Bible is a book of war and food and passion and lust and power. And the Judaism of the rabbis in exile is the opposite. It's disembodied, it's spiritualized, it's rootless, and it's highly ethical because Jews don't exercise military power. And now we're going to see the synthesis. The synthesis starts. So like Theodor Herzl, the man, is sort of the embodiment of this principle of Mashiach ben Yosef, like a redemption that seems to look like that of other nations. And it will give way to the new final synthesis in Zion that will, in coming back to his original philosophical concerns, a new synthesis of body and soul, and a new synthesis of Jewish morality and universal morality through a new Jewish collective in the land of Israel. And with that idea in hand, again, that he's come to through very unconventional ways, he becomes this major figure in the creation of the new Jewish institutions in the land of Israel. And as we'll talk about later on, extremely influential and controversial to this day. I'm just going to hop up and run out so I can get
And I'm going to ask you some questions.
in our office. Yes,
You hop and I'll ask some questions. And I want to just mention to people, if you raise your hand, we can't address you because there are too many of you. Happily, there are over 90 people on the webinar.
Wow.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you all.
That's terrific. But so please just type your questions in the chat. So there are a couple of questions. So you mentioned a couple of sources, if you will. You know, you mentioned the journals, you mentioned the other writings, you mentioned the journalism. I just want to underscore for people what you were speaking about. If you were to go on the website of the National, Israeli National Library now, which is now in a new place, but the digital collection doesn't need a physical place. There is something called the Historical Jewish Press. It's an unbelievable resource.
It's an incredible thing.
You can read anything you want in almost any language that Jews were writing from the onset of what we would call print journalism. So I urge you to look at that. And I think what you were trying to emphasize is that even a Lithuanian son of a Russian, Talmid Chacham was aware of this thing called print journalism. It would be like today, people, even if you don't go on TikTok, you probably know it's out there.
Well, and not only that, but that this was a period in a milieu of remarkable intellectual ferment, including among traditional rabbis.
Absolutely.
You see, like people who we regard as these Orthodox rabbinical figures, they're arguing about Hegel and Schelling and Kant and all that kind of thing in Hebrew and Yiddish in these newspapers.
Right. This is not a siloed rabbinic Judaism that people project backwards. So I do want to ask you, I do want to reflect from the chat a little bit more about the sources that you use for these early years. And then a question that I have, so you can just piggyback it later, is this idea that he, as you said, going to the land of Israel is a way of re-embodying, if you will, the Jewish experience. That is a deeply political Zionist idea, even if he doesn't see it that way. I mean, we have that in Nordau, we have that in Herzl, have that in other figures. So even though he's maybe separating himself from that, you can see a consonance, that's sort of a comment. So talk about the sources that you used, printed, manuscript, how'd you get at them? Yeah. Okay, and did they help illuminate a Kook that other people don't know?
Well, yeah, okay. So first, just regard to the other thing, yes, it's very Zionist, except the state doesn't interest him that much. He writes very little about the state, statecraft, diplomacy. What's really important for him is the Jewish people. And this also connects to a key idea in the Kabbalah, because remember, in the Kabbalah, in a deep sense, the Jewish people and the land of Israel and the oral Torah are all the Shekhinah. They are all God's embodied presence on earth. And so for him, the principle, so Torah Shebaal Peh, as the way Torah is interpreted and understood and lived by the Jewish people in the land of Israel, can be its own kind of revelation, etc. But the state as an institution doesn't interest him. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why his political legacy is so ambiguous. He's a man who hardly wrote about statehood and sovereignty, and then how do you try to run a state according to his ideas? Now, as far as the sources, it's a funny kind of thing. Because he's this heroic thinker, and because everybody knows that his thinking shifted a bit, I mean, the groundwork is laid before he comes to the land of Israel, but yet there's still immense development afterwards. So nobody really bothered to look at this. So much of his writing from these years was just lying around in plain sight. And it turned out I was one of the only people who ever bothered to look at it. This journal that he published in the 1880s, other things. I mean, I had people tell me, "You're reading this early stuff. It's so boring. Why are you bothering?" So a lot of this stuff was around. Some of the stuff was around, but hadn't been. So many of his works had been reprinted so many times over the years, and yet a number of these works had not been reprinted over the years, precisely because they weren't interested in. Didn't relate to Zionism at all. At some point, like he's not in favor of the Uganda plan, but he says in some of these writings that the people pushing the Uganda plan are like very well intentioned and all that kind of thing, which seems to be inconceivable relative to his later self. An important point about him is that his canonical theology, also a lot of, I was reading the halachic works, which are just straightforwardly in his response and so on. Now, as I said, he writes his notebooks. So his canonical works are edited out of his notebooks by like his disciples, especially his son, or Yehudah, and another very important disciple, David Kohen HaNazir, but others as well. Take the raw material of his notebooks and edit out of them these canonical works. Now, for years, we didn't have the notebooks in their original form. The notebooks start getting published in the 1990s in their original form. And they talk about political controversies. They get published in different editions. Some of the editions are very clearly censored. And there's some that are still, some of the notebooks are still under wraps just because of sheer shlumieliyut on the part of people. Others, there's some people say, no, like, we will not publish these notebooks because they might give aid and comfort to liberals or leftists or God knows who. So I think as a point when people read Rav Kook, and it can be very frustrating because he can be very difficult to read, and you should let yourself off the hook because he wasn't writing for you or for me. He's writing for himself. And he's also, part of what's so interesting is he's trying to create his own language that will be like a modern theological Hebrew. And so as I was working on this, some of these sources, some of these notebooks began to come out. I mean, I could talk at greater length about this, but what's also interesting is that you compare his esoteric writing with his exoteric writing. You see things that he's writing for public consumption, like for journals, and then you things that he's writing in his notebooks, and sometimes they're similar and sometimes they're different, or you see that what seems on the outside, what's written for public consumption, you could imagine some sort of like, cosmopolitan-minded modern Orthodox rabbi writing is actually grounded on like very radical Kabbalistic ideas. I can't hear you.
Nancy, you're on mute.
I want to ask, we have some other questions in the chat, and I realize I don't want to run out of time. We'll take the time we need. But someone asked just a straightforward question. When you use the word, and it's actually a little odd the way you said it, people took the canonical things out of his journal. So what do you actually mean by canonical?
What I mean is that there are these canonical texts, right? Sort of there's some of you when...
What makes them canonical, though?
Okay, by canonical, there are, okay. There's a publishing house established shortly after his death called Mossad HaRav Kook. It's a very important publishing house, and they have a series of works that are very famous and widely studied, and many of them have the word Orot in the title. Orot, which is sort of general reflections on Jewish nationalism, Jewish national revival. Orot HaKodesh, which is this 4-volume magnum opus of theology, and Orot HaTshuva, and Orot HaTorah, and all that sort of thing. And that sort of was for a long time the canon. And what those are an edited selection of his notebooks. Now,
okay, so I just want to say, so they were made canonical.
Right, they were made canonical by the religious Zionists who saw him as their spiritual godfather.
Right, okay.
Right.
That's
the thing.
It's a post.
Yes.
They become anthologized and selected, and it's like, one of my favorite examples of this is the edited version called Hannah Arendt's Jewish Writings. It's insane, right? You would never, she didn't separate her so-called Jewish writings from other writings. She wrote. Someone later wanting to position her as a Jewish thinker.
Right.
selected out her various writings and
And
anthologized.
also a big question in Rav Kook's studies is he a systematic thinker at all or not?
Right.
He didn't think of himself as a systematic thinker, but there is something like a system or certain very common themes and ideas weaving them all together.
Okay, so that's the last question for this section I'm going to ask. Someone said it is very well known, or it is well known, not the very, that was me, that Rav Kook was very eclectic and learned in just about every stream of thought, past and present, Jewish and non-Jewish, rational and mystical. In your opinion, was there any stream of thought that he wholeheartedly rejected? That was
well, yeah, I mean,
brave, and that he
that's interesting.
Why?
I've never seen him use Marxist terms because
Uh,
Marxism is so materialist.
Yeah.
Also, if you look at the philosophers that he kindled to, they tended to be people like in the idealist tradition. And I think in some ways that's because they are Neoplaton, they are working out of Neoplatonism in the same way that Kabbalah does, or to make it clear, like empiricists like David Hume, he knows about them, but they don't interest him all that much. Right. And again, I've never seen him, I think Marxism, he was deeply concerned about conflict. But I think there was the fact that Marxism, and he's like of a piece with some other Zionist thinkers like Aleph Dalet Gordon, for whom like the relentlessly conflictual nature of how Marxism sees the world with the materialism, that like I've never really seen reflected in him.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it may not be that you objected it, but he saw no meaning in it. It didn't reflect any of the.
It didn't speak to him.
Right.
And also certain kinds of liberalism don't speak. Like as it was somebody mentioned, I saw in the chat, his famous comment about like that the ideal state is like God's throne in the world. And he's differentiating that from like the thin liberal, like night watchman state,
Right. Okay, great. So we now have him, he's in Yafo. And I'm going to let you go, but famously, at least for those of us who think we know something about him, he was seen as someone, even though he was manifestly traditional in practice, he did not, at least in those years, fundamentally reject the secular team, the pioneers, seeing that they were part of a larger plan. So I'm sure you're going to talk about that, and please tell us more about what it was like when he, got to the land of Israel in those years.
Right. So he gets to the land of Israel, and he is electrified. He starts writing more about the land itself, as so to speak, like an entity, an ontological and spiritual entity in the world. He's even more fascinated than he was in Europe by these rebels, because also he starts to identify with them a bit, right? I mean, often there's passage of his that read, and you don't understand how a traditional rabbinic thinker can be saying this. You realize that he thinks that the heretics have a point about something, but he thinks they don't have the ultimate truth. And from the beginning, sort of like there's one episode that happens pretty early on that sort of sets the tone for what's going to happen later. Eliezer ben Yehudah, right, celebrated the person who revives Hebrew as a spoken language, is also a supporter of the Uganda plan. And at one point, Eliezer ben Yehudah writes in his newspaper saying that, people say that Ugandists like me are turning our back on the tradition. Well, guess what? We are. And guess what? That's a terrific thing, right? And so Rav Kook writes an open letter to him saying, oh, don't talk like that. You and you other, rebellious people, and you young Zionists, you really are committed to Jewish history. You really are doing wonderful things and all of that. So then he starts getting it from two directions. He starts getting it from Eliezer ben Yehudah et al., who say like, no, we're actually quite serious about rebelling against the tradition here, right? And he starts getting at it from rabbinical colleagues who are like, wait a second, why are you saying nice things about these heretics? Don't you know that they're terrible people? And he finds and in both of those, so to speak, camps of the modernists and the traditionalist rabbis, he finds people who actually do find him a very appealing sort of figure, who think that there needs to be some kind of bridging figure. And for him, the bridging thing, it's not just like a matter of community relations, it's rooted in his theology. Because also remember, again, like a word about the Kabbalah. For him, like the Kabbalah, a distinguishing feature of the Kabbalah is that the Kabbalah sees the world as constructed out of genuine differences, right? That justice is a force in the world and mercy is a force in the world, and sometimes they collide and ultimately they come together, right? And so for him, the Kabbalah is a way of seeing conflict. He starts looking at social and particularly ideological conflicts as the working out of larger ideas. So like in a really central passage that I love to teach, he talks about how any healthy individual and any healthy group has to sort of find itself tacking in between a tendency towards ethical universalism and a tendency towards collective and group identity and a longing for transcendence and the divine. And in the contemporary Jewish scene, especially in the land of Israel, each one has become the property of a party. So we have the ethical universalist party, and those are the liberals, and we have like, the meaningful collective party, and that's, the nationalists, and then we have the Orthodox, who are like the transcendence party, and everybody needs to sort of synthesize this in themselves. So this is a kind of a spiritual exercise that's also a socio-political exercise, and some people find it really appealing. Some people just don't know what the heck he's trying to do or what he wants from them. And others, what's so interesting is some of these secular revolutionaries who he's celebrating are saying, like, Rabbi, get over it. I'm not part of your wonderful revolution. Okay. I'm just not. I'm rejecting you for a reason. And in that respect, sort of like the more conservative / reactionary Orthodox figures and these chalutzim tend to understand each other very, very well, that they really are on different sides of the same camp. Another really interesting that happens in those years is he deepens his engagement with the arts and with literature. He's very close with Shmuel Yosef Agnon, eventually wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1966. And because he sees art and aesthetics as, because also then a crucial philosophical move in those years is that he comes to the conclusion that human idealism is God's way of working through the world, such that idealistic moves, whether it's towards social justice or aesthetics or working in one's community, everything that people do to make the world a better place, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish, is part of God's way of working through the world. Now, he also is very involved he's starting to get involved in creating a rabbinate, creating institutions, starting to think about what does halakha look like in these dramatically changed circumstances of the Jewish return to Palestine. He most famously, in 1910, it's a Shemitah year, a year of the sabbatical. And ordinarily the land is supposed to lie fallow and not be worked. Starting in the late 19th century, as traditional Jews began to develop agricultural enterprises in Palestine, people were starting to wonder what happens about the Shemitah year. And at some point, there's a discussion, well, the same way you sell chametz on Pesach to a non-Jew, maybe there's portions of the land of Israel, different plots of land, you sell them to a non-Jew, and that way it's not a problem to work the land on Shemitah. Understandably, there's no small pushback on this proposal. He decides to he endorses this proposal, and he writes a small halachic treatise to it on it, and then he also writes an historical philosophical introduction, in which he talks about the ways in which ideally, of course, everybody would do this, because Shemitah, the sabbatical year, it's not just like a religious commandment, it has a profound message for the modern world about the proper place of work and the proper place of society, right? Because also a crucial part of Shemitah is is releasing people from debts. And then of course every with the 50th year, right after 7 Shmitot, you have the Jubilee year and all the slaves go free. So that Shemitah is an ultimate vision of social justice and a good, just socioeconomic agricultural order, right? But we're not there yet. And so we are in process to there. And so I, so to speak, need to bend the halacha a bit where I can to sort of move towards that horizon. So this is very moving. It's very interesting. It's very compelling. And of course, for a number of his rabbinic peers, this is terrible. So like, here's this guy saying we need to bend the halacha to satisfy the whims of these people who are rebelling against the tradition, right? Whereas other people begin to say, no, maybe this guy's onto something, that this is how we can actually create some workable synthesis of the tradition. Now, at the outset of World War One, the outset of World War One finds him and he's remarried since, and he finds him and his wife in Europe, where they're there for medical treatments, and also crucially, he wants to attend a rabbinical conference where he can try to talk of Agudat Yisrael, and try to explain to his rabbinic peers, who matter deeply, deeply, deeply to him, why he thinks they ought to be finding better relations with the Zionists than they have, and how there might be opportunities for common cause and dialogue. So the war catches him in in Germany. He manages to avoid being interred as like an enemy national, because he's sort of like technically still Russian, because the Ottomans weren't exactly giving citizenship to Jews who moved to Palestine. Spends about a year in Switzerland, and then spends much of the war in London as the rabbi of the Eastern European Jewish community in London. And it gives him the opportunity to live in a big European capital, which he had never done before. And he has these remarkable reflections during the war. He writes about seeing the paintings of Rembrandt in the National Gallery, and sort of like how he sees like the bits of like the reflected light of the mystical light that God secreted away from creation, glimmering in Rembrandt's photos. During the war, he like many people at the outset of the war, he thinks, well, maybe this will be a good thing. Like when there's wars often bring great changes, because in many ways he's like a 19th century progressive idealist, right? Things are getting better. Maybe this will be the war to end all wars. As the war progresses, he's appalled by the slaughter, the rivers of blood, seeing like what he sees seems to be like the suicide of Western civilization destroying itself. Interestingly, he writes more polemically than ever before or since against Christianity, right? Sort of arguing that Christianity, oh, like, well, you did a really great job here of moralizing the human race, didn't you? But also crucially, because he's a deeply rabbinic figure who's a big believer in halakha and in the law. And so he regards the lawlessness and the ethical depravity of Europe as having a deep root by his understanding of Christian antinomianism, the Christian rejection of the law. So he's very torn apart by all this. Interestingly, also during the war, he has some of his most universalistic ideas, because he's at one and the same time a shockingly particularistic thinker. He has these highly essentialized views of Jews, and Jews as a distinct people, and Jews are almost physically different from other people, and the Jewish people are the repository of everything that goes on in the human race. And at the same time, he sees like, these are the passages when he writes that every human culture is an articulation. Every decent human culture is an articulation of God's voice in the world. Every religion has something to contribute. Art is a great expression of the human spirit, derived from God, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the Balfour Declaration, which at a stroke seems to confirm his sense that he was living in messianic times, right? Because earlier on, already in the Theodor Herzl eulogy in 1904, there's this sense that, like, his thesis is the Judaism of the Bible, the embodied Judaism in the Bible. Antithesis is the spiritualized, ethicized, disembodied religion of the rabbis. Synthesis will be the new Judaism, land of Israel, and then that is redemption, right? And he can be so open and accepting in many ways he has a sense of like, it's okay that all the contradictions in Jewish life are coming to the surface now because they're on the verge of messianic resolution, and boom, Balfour seems to confirm that for him. So he's very electrified by it. He returns to the land of Israel, as I said, in 1919, becomes the Ashkenazi rabbi of Jerusalem. Then 1921 becomes the founder of the chief rabbinate. Now, there's three figures at work in the creation of the chief rabbinate. There's the Zionists, there's the British, who in many ways they've inherited this institution from the Ottomans, right? Under the Ottomans, Jews, like Christians, ran their own religious communities and had their own religious courts and so on. And so the British are happy to continue this. And just now the difference is that there will also be an Ashkenazi figure, because under the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, there had been the Chacham Bashi, a Sephardic rabbi. So now there'll be two of them. And this is how colonials govern themselves. And they can take care of the things that don't really matter, like marriage, divorce, etc. And that's fine. The Zionists want a rabbinate because this is the era. This is after Balfour. this is what's called the period of the Jewish national home. They're building institutions. They also want to build religious institutions, which will represent Judaism, the Jewish people before the court of world public opinion, and which they can control, right? So that they can control these institutions, Jewish institutions, as they develop. And then you have Rav Kook. Rav Kook is this guy who wants to see this spiritual revolution, who thinks that he can sort of see the outlines of like a new halacha, a transfigured Jewish culture in a transformed world, and this rabbinate will sort of slowly help things move along. So he's marching to a very different drummer. And something that, and this is, in his vision is very beautiful. And during his years as chief rabbi, on the one hand, he rises to his greatest fame and public influence, but you also see the limitations. Right? He's a deeply conciliatory personality. He's always encouraging people to see the good sides of others and to recognize he has a point and he has a point, not in a namby-pamby split the difference kind of way, but because God's truth is multifaceted, right? And for God to be truthful and for God to be the truth of peace, as he says, is because there's genuine conflicts that only God can resolve. But that makes him and it's also very important to him that the rabbinate be apolitical. Like I said, he never joins the Zionist movement. He never joins a political party. The only political party with whom he expresses sympathy is Hapoel HaMizrahi, which was the religious Zionist workers party, right? Sort of like these socialist religious Zionists. He says once to somebody, I could never join a political party, but if I could, that would be it. And yet, because he doesn't want to join a political party, he can't get budgets and he can't get political support. Also, he doesn't want to alienate the rabbinical colleagues to his right, even though, right, sort of as institutionally what we call like the Eidah Haredit, the formal ultra-Orthodox community and its institutions existing as a separate and distinct entity under the general umbrella of national institutions is itself created because there's no way they're going to accept his authority, right? And then he dies in 1935. He dies in 1935, so he doesn't see the Holocaust and he doesn't see the state of Israel as it actually emerges in 1948. So what are you supposed to do? His son, Yehudah, one of his children from his second marriage, eventually takes over the yeshiva that he started, which was originally called Yeshiva Merkazit Olamit, and then because Yeshivat Merkaz Harav. And part of his program was to train a new kind of rabbi and a Zionist rabbis for the Zionist revolution. And again, his students create, say, the Bnei Akiva youth movement and create all kinds of educational institutions. Now, Tzvi Yehudah has to face the Holocaust and face the state of Israel. And Reb Tzvi Yehudah comes to the conclusion that indeed the state of Israel is established in 1948 with all of its flaws and its compromises is itself the first step of the realization of the Messianic Advent. That's what it is. And this becomes an extremely influential position, especially people think of like religious Zionism and settlements after 1967, and it's more after 1973. Because after the 1973 war, and this is especially pertinent to think of today, there is this sense that, the tradition, the standard political leadership has discredited itself. They've like blundered into this disastrous war. And so young religious Zionists, students of Tzvi Yehudah, say, we are the last Zionists. We are the last idealists. We are the ones who understand the true meaning of the Zionist revolution. We're the ones who understand how important Jewish sovereignty is. And so they create the settlement enterprise. That's not the only interpretation of Rav Kook, but it's a dominant one and one that's very important, as you might imagine, down to the present. In the Q&A, we can talk about some of the different nuances there.
Okay, so, there's just so much fantastic material, Yehudah. I mean, really.
Well,
I have a quick little question, but maybe we'll just talk about it later about whether or not he had a relationship with Nussen Birnbaum, but we can do that later. We can do that later.
Yeah, I don't really know the answer to that.
We have, so just for my audience, this is someone who started out as he's credited Nathan Birnbaum or Nussen Birnbaum with the term Zionismus, of being a Zionist, a secularist, became a territorialist, and then he became a very active member of Aguda Soil. So very interesting. Another really fascinating figure at this fin de siècle period, yes. Late 19th century into the 20th.
Right.
But let's leave my personal question aside. We have quite a few questions. I'm going to actually start with the last one, which in some ways is the most contemporary. to let you then go back a little bit about the legacy of Kook. So and for the other people, if we don't get to your questions, I will make sure that Professor Mirsky gets them with the hope that he can address them to me and then to you, and I would send them on to you. But here is the question. Rav Kook was known to be a lover of all human beings and very much promoted Jews and non-Jews living together in harmony. That's this questioner's opinion. Given that he passed away, he died before the state was founded, he never witnessed the suffering of Palestinians after the establishment of the Zionist project, the state, starting with what is called the Nakba by Palestinians, then the occupation after 67 or 73, as you said, rightfully after the Yom Kippur War, and continuing today. You probably don't have to answer this very post facto question, but still it might let you riff a little on some of what I know you've thought about in terms of his legacy. In your opinion, how would Rav Kook have reacted to our contemporary moment, to the treatment of Palestinians?
Right.
How would he have grappled with his own son's legacy in terms of being such an advocate of the land or nothing? So that will allow you to think about, to talk a little bit about the contemporary. Yeah.
Well, thank you, because it's such an important question. I would say two things. First, I'll talk about his own attitude towards the Arabs of Palestine and the conflict that began to emerge in his time. And then about the question of how one interprets him and interprets his son, and how do you think about all that, which is a very live question. So he himself, like many Zionists or people involved with the Zionist movement, sad truth is didn't notice or think much about the Arabs who were there, or to put it a little differently, like for so many people, because, distinctive Palestinian nationalism, there's a Palestinian sense of place. But as a national movement, it really starts emerging around 1910, 1911, and then gathers steam, of course, after World War I. And through those years and through the 1920s and the 1930s, there's in some ways reflected down to the present, but certainly then really big arguments among Palestinian activists and Arab activists. Is this a local Palestinian struggle? Is this part of a pan-Arab nationalist struggle? Is this a religious struggle, etc.? From the beginning, from the earliest statements that I've seen of his, from early on in his years in the land of Israel, he is foursquare against demonizing Arabs, talking about them in broad generalization as an enemy. As I said, he's very much an idealist. He very much thinks that the Jewish return to Zion can be done peacefully. In many respects, it often seems to me that he has a hard time, because he's this amazing, he's the kind of thinker and theologian who in some respects comes along only every few centuries, but he's also a man of his time and place. He has a very hard time imagining Jews with a lot of power and abusing it. At times, he's very enthused by the creation of the Jewish Legion, especially around the time of the Balfour Declaration. But the use of force is not something that he thinks about. It's not something he writes about. It's not something, there's certain aspects of the human condition in general that he doesn't write about. He doesn't write much about the will to power. He doesn't write about the profit motive, as P-R-O-F-I-T. He doesn't write about militarism. He doesn't think about it. He doesn't understand it. And it's rather foreign to him. And he also thinks that the same way, he's alive to the moral perils of nationalism. That's why in one of his early writings, there's this amazing passage where he says, he's talking about l'umiyut, the Hebrew word for nationalism. And he keeps saying, l'umiyut is not nationalismus. Right? Jewish nationalism has to be different, because nationalism itself can easily become, an argument or a justification for all kinds of xenophobic, violent, chauvinist things. And his argument is that's why Zionism has to be religious, because religion will preserve it within the framework of Jewish ethics and morals. When he starts seeing this conflict in 1929, with the riots of 1929, he very much like, and after the riots of 1929, the Mufti is writing, the Mufti of Jerusalem, the leader of the Palestinian National Movement, in many respects, person behind the 1929 riots, and who's very much trying to, who on the one hand is trying to make it very much a local Palestinian conflict and also not a pan-Arab but pan-Islamic conflict. So the Mufti is always trying to draw him into a war of words and sort of frame this as a religious conflict, because then, you sort of get things going. And Rav Kook resolutely refuses to go there. He absolutely refuses to be drawn into that. But it's, he is not one of those, like say, obviously Jabotinsky, but Ben Gurion in those years, who are seeing that there will be some sort of inevitable conflict. Now, as far as his son and disciples, so Rav Kook's legacy is large and capacious and composed of different parts. And say if we look, three main schools of thought that develop. There's, as we said, his son, or Yehudah Kook, who, like his father, is still wants to engage in partnership with the rest of the Zionist enterprise. You have this school of thought that I guess I identify with, and here very much with my late revered teacher, Rabbi Yehudah Amital, for whom the of the various dimensions of Rav Kook's teachings, like Rav Yehudah sort of emphasized the land of Israel, and Rav Amital, and Rav Amital argued that the ethical and universalist teachings of Rav Kook's were the ones that ought to more guide us in the present. And then you have a third school of thought, which is small but very influential, and its most prominent representative in government today is Bezalel Smotrich, is what's called the Chardal, Haredi Leumi, where if there was like a program or a formula to come out of Rav Kook, and again, it's so hard to take a thinker like this and summarize him to a program or formula. It seemed to be like being identification with the Jewish national movement, and while still being religiously traditional, but also being very open to dialogue and conversation and mutual learning with Western culture in general. And the Chardal school of thought, Haredi Leumi, says, well, no, we are part of the Jewish national movement, but we adopt a Haredi attitude towards secular culture, Western civilization, etc. And even as part of a national movement, Rav Kook, part of what's interesting about him, and as Hillel Zeitlin pointed out, Hillel Zeitlin, the great figure himself, pointed out, Rav Kook took Kabbalistic ideas and used them to explain concrete social and political movements in his time. Now, you can do that in a broad way, but then you can also try to do that in a very detailed way. Professor Sinkoff asked me earlier about Marxism. So about other schools of thought, and I said Rav Kook rejected Marxism, but latter-day Chardal people, especially the leading Chardal thinker, Rav Tzvi Tau, they are sort of Marxist or even Leninist in the sense that thanks to Rav Kook, they have the roadmap of they know exactly how things are supposed to work. And they know the place of the vanguard of religious Zionism in leading everything forward. Personally, that's a view I reject. And the question is, do I reject it as an interpretation of Rav Kook? Do I reject it as me? We can argue about, it's sort of the same way we can, take a thinker from the American founding and say, what would Benjamin Franklin have thought about the Missouri Compromise? We can sort of extrapolate, but we don't really know. But the question that I ask for myself, because I'm, on the one hand, somebody who teaches and writes about all of this, but I'm also a citizen of the state of Israel, in addition to being a citizen of the United States, and I'm an active and engaged person there. And so I have to make my own choices. So I'd put it like this, over the years, people sometimes, I sort of say my own political views are sort of more on the left, etc. And in as much as I'm supposed to be somebody who knows a thing or two about Rav Kook, given that many people on the right identify with Rav Kook for all sorts of reasons, especially the way he was interpreted by his son. So people will say, what, you understand Rav Kook better than his son did? And my answer to that is I don't claim to understand Rav Kook better than his son did. I think that in as much as I'm talking not even as an academic, not as an academic, but as somebody who's living within a tradition, my interpretive choices, especially for how they're governing how I act in the present, are moral choices. And I don't need, it's not a matter, I would put it like this. I imagine that one day, I will shuffle off this mortal coil and go to meet my maker. And I imagine that when I come before the divine judgment seat, God may ask me, so how come at such and such a day, time, whatever, as God reads Sefer HaZichronot, you were cruel to someone, or you mistreated someone. You did this thing that was unjust. I think if I were to say, I could be wrong, of course. I think if I were to say the Rebbeinu Shalom, I thought Rav Kook said it was okay. I imagine Rebbeinu Shalom will say, don't talk to me about Rav Kook. I talked to him a while ago. He and I are fine. That's not the issue. Why did you do what you did today? And so I don't think there's any religious thinker that one can take and sort of like obviously translate their ideas one, echad el echad, like in any one-to-one correspondence way with a specific political party or idea. Indeed, so much of all of theology, to my mind, especially if it's theology or prophetic religion, is a critique of political ideology, right? Because unlike ideology, theology is about a theos, is about a God who can never be contained and never be fully held and never, the prophet Amos says, let justice roll down like a mighty stream. Is there any conceivable piece of like socially responsible legislation we could ever enact that we could say, okay, justice is now officially hereby rolling down like a mighty stream? Of course not. So theology, I'd like to think, will always be a critique of ideology. And I think we've learned certainly from the history of the 20th century and afterwards, that to say that my theology is that I know exactly what God wants and I know how God wants history to work, and so I have to do this, even if it seems to result in great human cruelty, is just not something we can allow ourselves to do, even as we know that we live in a very complicated world that requires all kinds of messy choices and rotten compromises and tragic decisions along the way.
So there's much more to say, but I'm actually going to push you a little bit on what you just said about theology must be a critique of politics. Because I mean, in my own reading, and certainly not, I don't have the kiyut in this, some of the fervor with which the early settlers in Gush Emanim after 73, they said that, we're not criticizing the state. We're actually, we're not being political. We are actually doing what the tradition is requiring of us. The state it's failed us, and we are doing what's necessary. So I guess what I'm trying to say, even though I may agree with your moral evaluation of what's going on, I imagine there are very thoughtful, deep thinkers in certain parts of whatever. I don't want to get too much into politics, but who would disagree with you, meaning your positions, but who would say, in fact, I'm honoring the legacy of Rav Kook because it's not about politics. It's about the theological understanding of what's necessary now.
I do think that's true. I do think that's true, and I think it's okay that you're pushing me on this, because also I need to come clean about what are some of the things that I'm going to say and where I'm not going to go and where I'm not going to go. The folks that you're mentioning, I don't, it's all of our political views are like a package. Or what I mean, I'm not being articulate about it. I think they have a genuine sense of what's right. I mean, I think that, okay, so recently Reb Shlomo Aviner, a very important figure in religious Zionism, who also is was a great communicator, put together a checklist of an interesting figure, disciple of Yehudah, put a checklist of like 100 things how to tell if you're a religious Zionist or not. And one of the criteria for being a religious Zionist is you don't tell lies in the name of Rav Kook. So presumably he was referring to people like me, though not to flatter myself, because there are much greater people than me. I think that's true. I think, I mean, in those and there are people of the sort of the Tzvi Yehudah and more school with whom I'm in touch with, from whom I have a lot of respect. right? And I think that, yeah, they might say, yes, I think I can translate these ideas into politics, because politics is ultimately a vehicle of something larger and greater, and should be. And I think part of their challenge to Zionism is, the early Zionist figures understood that they needed to have some understand that somebody like Ben Gurion, like, really believed that he had a deeper understanding of Jewish history than many of his religious interlocutors. And then later generations of Israeli political leadership simply came to the de facto conclusion that they don't need to think about this; they can just farm it out to the religious people. I think that the challenge that assertive religious Zionism poses to Israeli mainstream, to Israeli liberals, is actually quite genuine. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say one other thing, which may be something you an assist here, if you will. I'm not a basketball player, which is that I think your work, which spoke, and your book says the early writings, right? Rav Kook died before the founding of the state, before the destruction of European Jewry.
Right.
And whatever we want to say about anything, the cataclysm of the destruction of European Jewry, and then the establishment of sovereignty are such radical. I don't know where to even put it. I'm always think about it. And when people talk about the Zionist project, and the state exists, it was founded in 48. It's a fact, and it has changed the course of Jewish history. And so, to sort of ask of a thinker like Rav Kook to understand what it would mean to be in 2024, wherever we are, is, I think, I've asked this too about figures I've written on, but we're historians, right? And our thinkers and the people we care about, they illuminate things, but they are not prognosticators. And so his son has every right or wrong to do what he wants to do, but he's living in his moment, in his post-state moment. And the way he then selects the ideas of his father, again, he's allowed to, we all do that, is a response to his reality and not to the reality of his father.
But also Rav Kook's thought can lend it to this, because unlike other theologians, he's talking about the political and social movements of his time. Right?
But those movements have changed, and the context have changed. Anyway, I think about him, World War I was his catastrophe.
Right.
Anyway, Professor Mirsky, Yehudah, I wish we were in the same room and we could have a longer conversation, but we are in a virtual reality, which means the reality has to end. I urge everyone to look at your work, particularly, to be blunt, the Jewish Lives book is more accessible, smaller.
It's not very accessible.
So, accessibility counts. And then that will whet your appetite for the big book. And to our public, I want to thank you for joining us as always. And I want you to make you aware of two upcoming programs. One is a conversation with pioneering female cantor, Susan Mandel, which is presented by the Jewish Music Forum. And that's a project of the American Society for Jewish Music. And it will take place on Thursday, February 29th on the Douglas campus. And the Bildner Center is a co-sponsor of that, but it is a program being generated by Mason Gross. Our next big program, and it's a big program, and I hope I'll see you there in person, is on March 4th. We have a discussion with two literary scholars and a film critic. The topic is Not Quite White in Fiction and Film, Laura Z. Hobson's Gentleman's Agreement, and Nella Larson's Passing. And this is a panel discussion that comes in the context of a symposium that I've organized with a visiting scholar at Rutgers called Black Americans, Jewish Americans, Historical Intersections, Collisions, and Passings. So I hope I'll see you there on March 4th, and I hope you'll be able to attend the Mason Gross program on Susan Mandel, Cantor Susan Mandel. And with that, I want to thank you for attending. I want to thank Professor Mirsky for, as always, incredibly rich,
everyone.
A rich Vorspeise taste of the extraordinary life and work and thought of Rav Kook. So good night.
Thank you all.